Spoiled. He's a pit bull. Whenever
Oh, ooh.
I'm a truck driver, and when I was driving over the road, he rode with me. So anytime I'm like not in his presence, he's looking for me, and if he can see me but can't get to me,
Yeah.
he freaks out. So my it makes for loud moaning outside the bathroom when I'm in the shower and stuff like that. So,
Well, I have a Great Pyrenees, and she never freaks out about anything. She is the most even-tempered, zen, spaced out dog I've ever had.
I have a buddy that he has a ranch or farm in Idaho, and he has or a couple of Pyrenees that he loves them.
They are great dogs.
But we're rolling. So I'm here with Jim Jatras.
Okay.
Y'all get to hear our background conversation that we were having coming into recording. Um, if you don't mind, Mr. Jatras, would you introduce yourself to my audience so they know who you are and where you come from and why you're on the show and yada yada yada.
Sure, sure. Well, you'll have to tell them why I'm on the show because you invited me. In terms of who the hell I am, I I come from a family of Greek origin. My parents were born here. All four of my grandparents were born in Sparta, and my father was a career Air Force officer, fighter pilot. Um, so I grew up in Greece, Germany, a few other places, a lot of places around the United States. Got an undergraduate degree in political science, rather stupidly, from Penn State, and then went to law school, even stupider, at Georgetown, and then went into the Foreign Service, which is U.S. diplomatic service for several years, including service in Mexico, and then at the Office of Soviet Union Affairs, and then for many years at the U.S. Senate, working in the Republican leadership there, mostly on foreign policy topics. And also, then after that, for several years, I was an evil Washington lobbyist, involved mostly again with foreign affairs. And now I'm a retired Virginia country gentleman. So I suppose the reason to talk to me, and maybe you can explain more, is that I'm supposed to know stuff about the world and what's happening in the world and politics and the spiritual side of things, obviously from an Orthodox Christian perspective, and what's going on wrong in the world, and also what's going wrong in the world.
you'll have I'm sure you'll have some insight. And as far as Orthodox, I just joined the church. I was accepted into the church chrismated on Christmas Eve. So
Congratulations.
well, thank you very much. So yeah, Saint Michael's Orthodox Christian Church in Beaumont is where I'm attending.
Very good. Wonderful. Glad to hear it. What were you before growing up?
I was raised Southern Baptist ish.
Mm-hmm.
So
Ish.
I went. Yeah, I
Yeah.
went. I mean, a lot of the churches I attended called themselves Bible churches and non-denominational.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, then in my 30s, I kind of abandoned all that. After my second divorce, I was like, this stuff it's not working. It doesn't matter what I do. This isn't working. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. And so I was just went full agnostic. And it was probably 12 years of seeing myself as an agnostic before running into orthodoxy and stumbling down that rabbit hole.
Good, good. Well, it's interesting. I get into a lot of religious discussions, let's say, on Twitter. Lately, I've been having some go arounds with some Calvinists who are, as somebody's pointed out, you've never met a Calvinist who's sure he's one of the predestined for damnation. It just so happens every Calvinist is sure he was predestined for salvation. Funny how that works.
Right.
But then also you get into the doctrine of assurance, and a lot of people in the Protestant evangelical world are absolutely sure they're saved the moment they say the sinner's prayer. And I don't know, I don't know how to deal with that sometimes. It's, they're so sure. And, I guess people can be sure of something that, well, you can't be sure of, but they are sure about it. So I don't know what you do with that.
Yeah, it's difficult. That worldview is really difficult. Whenever I look back at the way I viewed Christianity and God, um, I think I heard Father Stephen DeYoung said it the best, that the Protestant worldview is you check a box in your head, yes or no, and that's faith,
Mhm.
that's belief, that's as far as you
Yeah,
have to go
yeah.
with it. And it's not to say that there aren't good Christian men and women in the Protestant faith, but there are a lot of people. A lot of the faith is based around ideas and the way you think about things, and not necessarily how you live your life.
Mhm.
So, breaking into orthodoxy and learning, how to live, and the culture and habits and tradition and ritual and sacraments, it's something. It's very different.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you're right. There are a lot of good people in that world who do live exemplary lives and perform good works. In many cases, that certainly put us to shame, many of us. But I guess it's also like you said, it's sort of in their head. It's like, okay, that's not none of that really matters because that would be work salvation. They don't believe in work
R-
salvation, but of course it does matter, and in many cases, the credit to them, they don't believe it's a credit to them. So sometimes between what goes on in somebody's head and the way their lives are lived are two different things. But I guess we don't discount the value of it just for that.
Right, right. And this is perfect getting into this at the beginning, because one of the first bullet points I had as far as our topic of Ukraine and Russia to talk about is the importance of orthodoxy to Eastern Europe, and how that
Mhm.
ties together that culture so tightly, and what it means. So would you dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. As we know, Christianity and specifically Orthodox Christianity has very deep roots in this part of the world. I think at least everybody should be familiar with the story of Saint Prince Vladimir of Kiev and how he was shopping for a religion for his people. He checked out Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity and Judaism and Islam. Um, uh, there's the story that he was actually inclined originally toward Islam because he had many wives and concubines, and he found out the Christians just limited to one, and he didn't like that idea. But then he found out the Muslims can't drink, and he said, "Hold on there a second." He said, "Drinking is the joy of the roots. We cannot live without that pleasure." So he decided he'd become a Christian instead. But also that the envoys they sent to Constantinople were overawed by the beauty of the Orthodox worship, that they knew not whether they were in heaven or on earth. And of course, from that beginning in Kiev, it spread out through the land of the Rus. Again, sometimes people refer to Kievan Rus as the ancient state. It was never called Kievan Rus. It was just called Rus, or the land of the Rus. It was a
Mm.
group of principalities that included not only what is most of, but not all of today's Ukraine, but also all of Belarus and big chunks of what is now Russia. That the second city after Kiev was Novgorod, and then other cities like Chernigov, Vladimir Suzdal, and others. So it was a process of centuries. Sometimes people say the Orthodox Church doesn't do missionary work. It wasn't just like Vladimir snapped his fingers and everybody instantly became a Christian. They had to perform very intensive missionary work among the Slavic and the Finnish tribes of what constituted Rus and the outlying areas, and that took centuries to complete. But at the same time, it's something that entered very, very deeply into the soul, into the culture of the people there. So much so that you really can't separate their mentality from that. Even little things like the Russian word for Sunday, Voskresenie, means resurrection day. I mean, it's the
Mhm.
even in the very language, the word for thank you, spasibo, means spasi Bog, God save you. So there's this sense that all of life was really baptized in these countries, and that's one reason I think we see so much of the viciousness of the Bolshevik Revolution when it began in 1917 to just through the most kind of vicious and vile violence to try to uproot the religion from the people, and it didn't happen. After 3 generations, and they simply could not do it. And now we see it making a thundering comeback in Russia, which I think very few people would have predicted. And of course, Orthodoxy is just as central to the Ukrainian people as well. We can get into the whole issue of what is the relationship between Russians and Ukrainians, but one thing that does tie them together is their Orthodoxy. If you look at Ukraine within its current, or maybe we should say soon to be former borders, the only part of Ukraine that's not Orthodox is the far west, which was under Austrian and then Polish rule, where the people either by choice or by coercion ended up in union with the Roman Catholic Church as what they call Greek Catholics or Eastern Rite Catholics or Uniats. But that's only about 10%, max 15% of Ukraine's historic population. But that's also the identity that has been foisted upon all of Ukraine during these two revolutions that took place in 2004 and 5, and then again in 2014, to try to force Ukraine into a Western mold, take this square peg and shove it into a round pole of a regular Western European rainbow flag worshiping godless country, which I don't think sits well with anybody in Ukraine. That's what I'm sure one of the things we'll get into here in terms of the West versus what's going on now in Ukraine is this mania of the Western countries to take these post-Christian, revolutionary, destructive, frankly, satanic values and try to force the Eastern countries to accept them. I think Patriarch Kirill, the patriarch of the Russian Church, spoke the absolute truth when he said, what all these countries in the West, what they really want, they want us to have a pride parade. That whatever else you do, you have to have a pride parade. Well, they're not having one in Moscow, and they're not going to have one in Crimea. They had them in Kiev. You may remember from the Trump impeachment, Maria Yovanovitch, the ambassador, was there, who was testifying against Trump in the impeachment trial. Well, there's just wonderful pictures and video of her and the embassy staff representing you and me. That's, this is America, skipping down the streets of Kiev with the American flag and the rainbow flag to demonstrate our democratic values. That's what it's come down to in a lot of these countries. And frankly, people there don't like it. I mean, they tried to have a parade in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, a couple of years ago, and a guy named Levon Vasadze and some of the fathers in Tbilisi, they said, we're not having this. And they went out there, they shut down the parade, and then they went and trashed the offices of the LGBT organization there in Tbilisi. So, people there don't like this sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, you brought up the Bolshevik War, and their attack on Orthodoxy specifically. How does that compare to what we're seeing today?
Well, in terms of what we're seeing today, at least so far, we're not talking about anything as horrendous in terms of a death toll. I mean, we're not seeing, priests and monks and nuns being shot by the thousands or hundreds and so forth. I mean, we're talking about in Bolshevik time, we're talking about tens of thousands of clergy, millions of people actually were killed, and not to mention those who were sent to concentration camps and died there and so forth. In Ukraine, we're not seeing that kind of, brutality. We are seeing brutality of a sort where they take over churches and monasteries that belong to the canonical church, and they try to give them to the schismatic church that was created by, sad to say, the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople, as well as by the U.S. and Ukrainian governments. There has been some violence directed against clergy, like, priests being roughed up, being called in for questioning or arrested by the SBU, which is the Ukrainian successor to the KGB. There have been violent takeovers of parishes where, for example, a parish that belongs to the canonical church has a lot of people they've never seen before come tromping in through the door saying, oh, we're now parishioners in this church and we vote to go to the fake church. So then the church property gets taken over and given into the fake church. So, it's an illegal, violent violation of human rights, religious freedom, all the stuff our government supposedly believes in. There is some violence associated with it. I'm not aware of anybody being killed. So in that respect, it's, to be honest, it's light years away from what the Bolsheviks did in that
Right.
regard, but it's not what we would expect from a rule of law state, much less one that claims to be democratic and European and all that nonsense.
Right. Yeah. In what was it, in 1948, the CIA had infiltrated the See of Antioch. Am I mistaken about that
No,
time frame?
Constantinople. No,
Constantinople.
Constantinople. What happened is Patriarch Maximos at the time was considered too favorable toward the Russian Church, and which, again, to be honest, was under the control of the Soviets at that time. So again, this is Cold War politics. The U.S. government, the Greek government, the Turkish government all agreed that Maximos had to go. They found a way to get him out of there, and they replaced him with Patriarch Athenagoras, who had been the Archbishop in the United States. And he made it clear from the beginning, he worked for us. He worked for the American government, which, look, again, and to be fair, in the Cold War, you can sort of understand that. But unfortunately, that situation of dependency continues to this day, where there's a very, very close relationship. And, and one of the things you see, for example, is Jeffrey Pyatt, who had been the U.S. ambassador in Kiev in 2014, when the government there was overthrown and this regime came to power. The one who's caught on the phone call with Victoria Nuland saying, F the EU and Yats is the guy and all that kind of stuff. He later then became ambassador to Greece, and he's been very, very active with going around to countries like, Bulgaria and Romania and Cyprus and other countries to try to, arm twist their churches into recognizing the fake church in Ukraine. So this is somebody who not only had his hands on the political regime change in Kiev in 2014, he also has his hands on, he's not there in that job anymore, had his hands in the church politics as well, because people in Washington and at Langley, they know how important, back to your initial point, religion is, and the Orthodox Church is in these countries. And just as in 2014, they sought to break the political connections between Russia and Ukraine, they're also now working very hard to break the spiritual connections between Russians and Ukrainians.
And I was looking for the news story right here, and I can't seem to find the guy's name, but there was a CIA agent that was actually given credit for setting up the new Ukrainian church, as well as Patriarch Bartholomew. And so you can kind of see the loose ties here, where you're getting the new patriarch of Ukraine. Oh, here it is. CIA agent Jack Devine for his work in the 90s to create the new Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And he's also, they're also giving a lot of credit to Patriarch Bartholomew for his work in setting up the new church in Ukraine. So you can kind of see the continuing ties in Constantinople without necessarily direct evidence in Jack Devine hugging Bartholomew. But even after all this has gone down, Bartholomew then came to the U.S., met with Blinken, met with President Biden. And so there is definitely, it's well known and well documented, the infiltration of the Catholic Church, through Operation Gladio and those World War II antics. It's not quite as well known, at least here in the West, about how the Orthodox Church has been utilized by the CIA in order to influence the politics of Eastern Europe. But given how powerful the church has always been in Eastern Europe, it's no shock.
Right. That's right. And you raise a good point there with regard to Operation Gladio in the Vatican, because who is the closest chum in the Orthodox Church with Pope Francis in the Vatican? That's Patriarch Bartholomew. In fact, there was an article I saw recently. I tweeted it out. I can't remember. I think it might have been a National Catholic Reporter, but I have to check that there are people in the Roman Catholic Church, and I don't think we're talking about good solid traditionalist Catholics either. We're talking about modernist types who are celebrating that the war in Ukraine, in their view, I don't think they're right about this, but in their view, is marginalizing the Russian Church so that the Vatican could proceed on its forward path of ecumenism with Constantinople toward what reportedly Patriarch Bartholomew and Pope Francis hope will be a common dating of Easter, of Pascha, starting in 2025 on the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. And again, this idea that Western politics and their I don't want to say puppets necessarily, but certainly the people who are under their influence in both the Vatican and in the FANAR are proceeding on an agenda that will split the Orthodox Church, where they then can take advantage of that split and at least bring some of them directly into union with Rome, and maybe then more tightly under the control of some of these Western powers that have their own agenda, which is certainly not a Christian spiritual one.
Yeah, and as we move through the Cold War, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it seemed like in the mid to late 90s, you started seeing an uprise in Ukrainian nationalism. And I was reading an article earlier where it was talking about the Ukrainian nationalists of the late 90s, early 2000s actually fighting alongside the Chechens against the Russians.
Yeah, I'd seen some references to that as well. And let's remember, at the time Ukraine became independent, and really happened kind of by accident. It was kind of a deus ex machina kind of thing, where Ukraine had never been able to establish itself as a viable independent state. There's an attempt to do so in 1918 when the Russian Empire fell apart, and that was not successful either. But the idea that, yes, there should be an independent Ukrainian state, but not most people in Ukraine were for that. People like to point to a referendum was held in Ukraine in late 1991, just before the Soviet Union fell apart, where a large majority of Ukrainians voted for an independent sovereign state. Well, of course, it was clear at that point that the Soviet Union was falling apart. There had been another referendum in the spring of 1991, where a very large majority of Ukrainians voted to remain in a common state with Russia and Belarus and the other core republics of the Soviet Union. So the idea that there was this huge upswell of Ukrainians desiring to have an independent state, much less a nationalist ideology, just is not there. They were basically faced with the fact that the country they'd grown up with, it was falling apart. I can't tell you how many times when I've been to Ukraine, you find people who say, yeah, well, they like things better when they were it was the Soviet Union, when it was one big country. It didn't mean they're necessarily pro-communist, but there was the country they grew up with, many of them. What would you had happened, though, as I mentioned earlier about the far West being the only part of the country that is not Orthodox, that's where the real militant Banderist ideology comes from. This very kind of, I don't want to overplay the terminology, neo-Nazi and terms like that, but there's a real element of truth to that. And that's where you get that ideology about, no, this is what it means to be Ukrainian. To be Ukrainian, you must agree with this ideology. That didn't, that was very much still a minority view in Ukraine when it became independent in 1991, but it's something that grew through the 90s, as you mentioned, and then especially with the two unconstitutional overthrows of government that occurred against an elected government that largely voted by people from the east and south in Ukraine. That's when they were really able to take that ideology and formalize it as the Ukrainian state ideology and try to force it on people who didn't agree with it.
Let's dig into those periods. We had what was it, 2004? It was the Orange Revolution, and then in 2014 you had Maidan, right?
That's correct, and both of them were against Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych was the prime minister in 2004. He ran for president in those days. He won the first round of the election, but then everybody said it was fraudulent. The U.S. government said it was fraudulent. And, rather than brass it out, get himself sworn in, and then deal with the fallout, he hesitated and said, well, what should I do? What should I do? And he backed down. He backed down, agreed to a second do-over of the second round of the election, and then predictably lost that round. So then he accepted that. Okay, fine. He'll be the leader of the opposition. He was then for several years. And then in 2010, he ran, won, and nobody really contested that. But then he was overthrown in 2014 because, people say, well, he was corrupt. Well, if that's the standard, nobody should ever be president of Ukraine, because the whole country has been, like they say, it's got enough corruption to make a Nigerian prince blush. I mean, it's that corrupt of a country. But it's the other argument was that, well, he refused to sign an association agreement with the European Union. Yanukovych, to his credit, always took the view that Ukraine must be a bridge between Russia and Europe, not a wall. Because they knew if there was going to be a wall, it was going to go right down the middle of Ukraine and destroy the place. And he didn't even reject this agreement with the European Union. He just said, look, the way this agreement is structured, it will be a disaster economically for Ukraine. I need to have some revisions. We need to keep negotiating. Just that was enough to give an excuse, a pretext to activate what clearly was a pre-planned color revolution against him that had been prepared by all the NGOs and by American and European money to mobilize people in the streets to overthrow his government, which is precisely what happened.
In between those two revolutions, in between 2004 and 2014, we had the snow revolution in 2011, or the protests in Russia that they were claiming was going to be a revolution to overthrow Putin, but it didn't go through. If I understand correctly, the fallout from that was when Putin kicked out all the U.S. NGOs out of the country, including USAID, and he banned George Soros from doing business in the country because of all the funding that was running through these NGOs and funding these protests. So how much does that have to do with the current situation as well?
Well, it has a lot to do with it. I mean, there's a history of these so-called color revolutions, or that go back into the 90s, and it is interesting. There, you point out the role of the NGOs. NGO means non-governmental organizations. Who funds most of these NGOs? Mostly various Western governments. So they're not really non-government at all. Sometimes they call them quangos, quasi-non-governmental organizations, which means really governmental organizations, that they're actually, if let's put it this way, if people were mobilizing on the streets here in Washington to overthrow an election based on funding they got through foundations set up by the Chinese and the Russian governments, how many people would consider those non-governmental organizations rather than foreign agents, which is what they really are? And it took some time. Frankly, the Russians are sometimes slow on the draw about these things. It took some time for them to figure out, wait a minute, these things are not civil society organizations at all. These are actually agents for foreign governments, and we cannot tolerate this. And of course, here we would not tolerate it for a New York Minute. So they did shut those things down. And I think now they sort of have figured out what the antidote is to these fake democratic revolutions. As we saw, I think it was 2020, the effort to overthrow the government in Belarus, President Lukashenko. There was an attempt in just before the Ukraine war started to overthrow the government of Kazakhstan. So, I think they have sort of figured out that these revolutions can be thwarted if you, as you pointed out, get rid of some of the organizations that foment them, and also, frankly, you stand your ground. You don't try to compromise with them. You don't try to cut a deal with them, because the deal will not be kept. I mean, let's remember that in February 21, 22, the night of in 2014 in Ukraine, that Yanukovych actually reached a deal with the opposition to say, okay, fine. We'll call the police off. You back down in the crowd out there, and we'll have early elections. I think like 6 months later, which would have been about 6 months before the scheduled election would take place. And everybody knew that Yanukovych would lose that election. That wasn't good enough. As soon as the deal was signed and the police were withdrawn, the crowd surged in, and basically Yanukovych had to flee for his life. And they simply took control of the government. And the French and the British, the French, the Germans, and the Polish governments who had guaranteed that deal. And instead of telling their foot soldiers to say, now, come on, wait a minute, we have a deal now. Let's stick to the deal and have the early elections. They said, well, he left the capital, huh? I guess the deal's off and we're in control now, which is exactly what they did.
And that's what led.
I think that the other side said, finally figured out you cannot deal with these people. You cannot negotiate. You cannot compromise. And that, unfortunately, I think also plagues us in terms of how this war in Ukraine is going to end, too.
Well, and that's what led to the Civil War beginning. And then you had the East, and you had the neo-Nazis, so to speak, going into the East and fighting against them. And it seemed to me like the way it looked to me was Russia was actually kind of hesitant to enter into Ukraine until Zelensky had the Ukrainian military actually shelling the eastern portion of Ukraine to get them basically back under Ukrainian rule, because they were kind of a semi-autonomous zone.
Yeah, and the well, first off, you have Crimea, and clearly, one of the things that was very important to the Russians at that point was that when they saw that the West was not going to keep any kind of deal in Kiev, they said, "All right, we have to make sure that the Crimea, where the big naval base is, does not fall into hostile hands," because they knew that if that happened, there would soon be a NATO base operating out of Crimea, and that the Black Sea would become a NATO lake, not a Russian lake. So they sent the little green men in, and they obviously had a pre-planned program to take control of Crimea, which they did. They also helped people in eastern Ukraine who did not want to live under what they thought was now a hostile regime that had overthrown the president they had elected. I don't know what the level or nature of all the support was, but there were several republics that were declared in eastern and southern Ukraine, in Lugansk and Donetsk and in Kharkov, and also in Odessa. Only Lugansk and Donetsk were they able to hold on to. The other ones were brutally put down. We all know the story of the dozens of people that were burned alive in the trade union building in Odessa by very radical Ukrainian nationalists. Mm-hmm. So, but even at that, the Russians did not want those areas to leave Ukraine. They still wanted to preserve a Ukrainian state, and they told the people in Donetsk and Lugansk, despite their wish to leave Ukraine and join Russia, say, no, you need to stay in Ukraine. And that what Ukraine needs to do under the Minsk agreement is to be decentralized, to be federalized, to respect the Russian language, and so forth. And that was a big disappointment for people in those regions. In fact, it cost the lives of many of those people because, as with everything else, the Western powers in Kiev was not keeping those agreements. They were still shelling those areas throughout the 8 years between the 2014-15 war and the beginning of this war in 2022. And so it was only at the last straw they finally said, okay, that's it. We cannot talk to these people. They won't compromise. They won't negotiate. They're preparing for a kind of an Operation Storm of the kind that the Croatians used with American help to destroy the Serbian Krajinas in 1995. We finally have to do something. So they finally did.
Right. And that's one thing I've been saying a lot since this all started in 2022. I had Dave DeCamp on last year, went right at the beginning of it all. And we talked about how this wasn't a new war. This was just an expansion of the Civil War, and that the proxy war had necessarily gone hot, and now NATO was on the line because of all the expansion that they had been implementing right up to the border of Russia. They had finally crossed the line with Russia, and Zelensky, by going back on his promises of when he was elected, of getting along with Russia, and broke the Minsk agreement continuously. And Russia was just like, we have to do something. And I remember reading an article that Alexander Dugin wrote stating that it's about time that Putin should have done this in 2014.
Yeah, Yeah, and I know a lot of people say that, and I can see their point. At the same time, whether yeah, militarily, the Russians I think could have prevailed very handily in 2014. The Ukrainian armed forces were not in any kind of shape, as opposed to the 8 years that NATO had to build them up prior to 2022. The problem was, and I think this is a valid concern from Moscow's perspective, is that economically and financially they were a lot more vulnerable then. And during the 8 years that the Ukrainian armed forces has been being built up by NATO, the Russians have also been building up their armed forces, but even more importantly, they've been building up their financial and economic ability to withstand sanctions, and also in that regard, really cementing their ties with the Chinese and Chinese support for Russia in that regard. So I think they're, because I remember what President Biden said, we're going to turn the ruble into rubble. They thought they would pull them out of SWIFT, they would put sanctions on them, and then Russia would collapse like a house of cards. There'd be regime change and all that. I mean, there's a lot of talk, and I think there's something to it, that one reason the West stonewalled the Russian ultimata in late 2021 is that they wanted the Russians to go into Ukraine because they thought they would run up against an immovable rock in the Ukrainian military, but also the sanctions would destroy Russia. It would cause a mass dislocation in the Russian economy and cause the Putin government to collapse. Well, that didn't happen. And in fact, it's been getting stronger. The one who's in danger of collapsing is actually the European economies. We're going to fight to the last Ukrainian militarily and to the last European economically. And really now it's the Western side is in very difficult straits.
Well, yeah, it really seemed like it was kind of like the Afghanistan move, right? Drawing the Soviet
Mhm.
Union into
Yes.
Afghanistan to collapse their economy, was similar. Was supposed to be their Vietnam, and I think drawing Russia into Ukraine was supposed to be their Afghanistan. And you could see with the sanctions, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, that they were trying everything they could, but the ruble just kept getting stronger because Russia had put a backbone behind it and they had backed their currency. Whereas it doesn't seem like NATO or the West or whoever you want to blame, which I would say it's probably a lot of it's the US, thought in any detail about what the destruction of that pipeline would mean to countries like Germany and countries that depended on that natural gas for their heat throughout the winter.
Yeah, exactly. And I can't help but wonder, to tell the truth, I don't know if the Russians could have foreseen how unsuccessful the Western sanctions and the Western strategy would be. In other words, I mean, it'd be one thing for them to say, okay, we think we think we're protected here. We think we can uphold our currency. We think we can maintain our markets for exports of our energy and our metals and fertilizer and all that stuff. I don't think they could have foreseen how successful that would have been. I almost wonder, though, who was catfishing whom here. I mean, the West wanted to draw the Russians in the Ukraine, or maybe there's an element of, hey, don't throw me in that briar patch. That okay, you want to draw us into Ukraine, but we want you to draw us into Ukraine so we can draw you into something that's going to destroy your economies instead. Do they think that
Right.
all out? If they are, they really are genius.
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
if they possibly could have thought that through, but anyway, that's the way it's working out. And then we have this bizarre phenomenon, as you mentioned, with the Germans. We're waging economic war against our own allies now,
Yeah.
particularly Germany, which is the key, the key component of the European economy. I mean, what struck me is just how passive the Germans have been. Here they have their supposedly their best buddy in the whole world tanking their economy, and they just take it. Yes, sir. I have another, sir. Thank you, sir. I mean, it's really pathetic. They just don't make Germans like they used to.
Yeah. I was looking here at this Mark Hackert article from 2014 that he posted up at Jay's Analysis. And the first paragraph struck me. I thought I'd let you comment on it because I'm sure you're going to have plenty to say about it. Says what do postmodern exhibitionists, Islamic holy warriors, and marauding ultranationalists share in common? seemingly little aside from the fact that these bizarre bedfellows are the star assets of U.S. policy in Eurasia. And despite their use of very different tactics, they all are tasked with the same mission to undermine Russia, the only great power consistently opposed to American hegemony.
I think that's absolutely accurate. One of my go-to pieces I like to point to people is something that was, I think it was 1996, toward a neo-Reaganite foreign policy in Foreign Affairs magazine by Robert Kagan and William Kristol, two of the prime ideologists of the neocon perspective in Washington. Mm. And they basically called for something called what they called benevolent global hegemony. It should be the goal of the United States to extend its rule over all of the world as the hegemonic power for their own good, of course. Right. And it raised the question, well, what if the Russians and the Chinese don't like that? We should take that as a compliment. Now, keep in mind, this is 1996. We had Yeltsin in power. He was essentially an American puppet. We got him, in fact, it was a cover of either Newsweek or Times saying detailed how the United States got Yeltsin reelected over the communist candidate, Zyuganov, with American money, American NGOs, the whole thing. At the same time, our relationship with China was extremely good at that time. So here we are essentially telling these two countries that are willing to play ball with America as the dominant power in the world, that is not good enough, that you have to accept that we are the hegemon, we are the ruling power in the world, and you have nothing really to say about it. And inevitably there was going to be a reaction. Now we've seen it. China is the number one economy in the world. I think if you stop cooking the books and looking at phony financial assets from Wall Street and look at actual production, there's no question about that. And of course, the Russians are a military power, at least comparable to us, and I think in most respects actually greater than us. I mean, we have a better Navy than they do, but in terms of land forces, they're simply not a comparison. And in terms of nuclear forces, theirs are somewhat stronger than ours. And they also have hypersonic and other weapons that we do not yet have. And so we have bought ourselves a world of hurt here through our arrogance and our desire with this kind of almost neo-Bolshevik mentality to spread what I like to call rainbow fascism over the whole world. That's kind of a form of Gnosticism that in some ways, that after having defeated the Soviet Union, we say, now let's become the new Soviet Union ourselves, where they want to have, proletarian internationalism. Will have, rainbow flags and feminism and democracy and multiculturalism, and as long as they obey orders from Washington. And of course, the corporate takeovers of, all the pharmaceutical companies and the armed companies and the IT and entertainment companies. It really is kind of a if we think of fascism as kind of a unholy alliance between big business and government, it really is a kind of a fascism, but it's woke fascism. It's rainbow fascism.
Yes. Well, and you brought up that Crystal Clavin article. I always kind of considered that kind of an extension of Zbigniew Brzezinski's idea in the grand chessboard, and kind of what Brzezinski was drawing out there. And I remember reading the chapter on Russia and Ukraine, Eurasia in general. And he spent a lot of time talking about the natural gas, and come to find out, I mean, that's what all of this boils down to when you look at it.
Well, there's an interesting point on that, because I can remember, I was at the Soviet desk at the State Department from 1981 to 83, and then I was in the office of the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, and then I was in the Hill at the time the Soviet Union broke down. But I thought it was the oddest thing that even in the middle of the 1990s, again, when we had a controlled government in Moscow, we already had a special office at the State Department, the job of which was essentially to try to frustrate Moscow's ability to export its oil and gas. we're already looking at things like the so-called Nabucco pipeline and others, the Baku Jehan pipeline. There was a lot of pipeline politics going on, even in the 1990s, when supposedly, hey, look, there's no more communism. We're all supposed to be friends now. Of course, Russia should be just another normal country just trying to do business and sell its products like the Saudis do and everybody else. No, we didn't want that. We wanted to make sure they stayed bottled up and that their energy resources and other resources that they wanted to do business with would be frustrated. It really is hard to explain, and except in terms of what you described, it's really uh, just almost like a vendetta against a country that we just will see as bad no matter what they do. And in fact, I would go further. When I was at the State Department, I don't think you could count on one hand how many real anti-communists were at the State Department. You didn't even need your thumb to count them. And this is during the Reagan administration. People there were not pro-Soviet, but they didn't really feel strongly hostile to Soviet Union as a communist country. It's only when the red flag came down and the white, blue, and red flag went up, and that became a Christian country again rather than a communist country. That's when suddenly all the Russia haters came out of the woodwork. It's really a very odd thing. We see much more hatred to get directed against Russia and particularly against Putin than we ever saw against the Soviet Union or against Brezhnev or Khrushchev or even Stalin.
I think it's because the amount of resources in that general region is the only, it gives access to Russia to compete with the US on a global economic scale. And it's the only government that on a basis of resources controls enough resources to give America a run for their money as far as the global hegemony.
Well, I think that's true, but I don't think that's the whole truth. In other words, I don't think it can be 100% attributed to that. First off, it doesn't explain the hatred. Why do these people
Yeah.
hate Russia more than they hated the Soviet Union? Why do they demonize Putin more than Stalin? There's something emotional, ideological, and spiritual in that. The other thing that strikes me is this. I mean, I've heard people say that part of the reason we're destroying the German economy is so that all those businesses will have to relocate to the United States, and that will build up the American economy. When have these people ever shown any interest in building up the American economy? They've spent the last half century systematically dismantling the American economy, especially the manufacturing economy, in favor of extending our rule over the whole world and flooding America with cheap foreign-made goods, including from China, at the same time that it undercuts our own manufacturers and shuts down our factories here at home. So what indication is there that these people actually care about building up the American economy? They fault the Chinese and the Russians and other countries for the Belt and Road Initiative, for building connectivity throughout Eurasia. Where is our Belt and Road Initiative? Where is our connectivity throughout the Western Hemisphere? We don't build anything anymore. We don't build roads. We don't build airports. We don't build anything, but we do try to disrupt other countries when they want to build things. What does that tell you about the mentality of our leaders?
Yeah, man, it gets me thinking
I mean,
about
in other
the
words, it's not about making America great. In other words, it's like it is beggar thy neighbor. It's that we don't care about building ourselves up anymore. We just care about torpedoing you, and
right.
there's something kind of sick about that.
Yeah, well, and that's what I was trying to get to. It's like you said, what is the vitriol, the hate for Russia? Where does that come from? Because you don't see the same type of vitriol from Washington, from DC, from the elites, the established, from the West in general, the global like order, whatever you would like to call it, the global economic order, the new world order, whatever you want to call it. You don't see the same type of vitriol towards any other nation, right? They call
No,
China the model
no.
to be followed. Russia is the only nation that they look at in this way. Maybe, and I guess just from my own experience and from looking at the way that our country is going, and the way and looking at the people that we demonize here within our own borders, it's the traditionalism. It's
Exactly
that
right.
holding on to
Yeah.
tradition.
Yeah,
And they don't
yeah,
like
and
that.
the only other country I can think that really has gotten the same kind of treatment as the Russians have gotten was Serbia in the 1990s, and there's a connection there. They were sort of looked at as like a miniature version of Russia, and almost like a test run for breaking up Yugoslavia, the way they broke up Russia and demonizing the Serbs as a people. And by the way, I do think there's a common element there in terms of what back to Orthodoxy. I wrote an article in 1997, I think it was, called Pravoslavophobia. It was in Chronicles magazine. And basically how, that's interesting. If you look at the multiculti Westerners, they love other foreign cultures, especially if they're non-European, Asian and African, they're just so exotic and they have so much to teach us. And they're just so wise and it takes a village and all that kind of nonsense. But they don't feel that way about the Orthodox zone in Europe. They look at them as somehow retrograde or second-rate Europeans. They're not like normal Western Europeans who write in the Latin alphabet. They've got funny priests that wear long beards and they write in funny alphabets and things like that. So I think there is a kind of an odd cultural bias against what we might call the Byzantine sphere of culture. But then I think it also relates to what you say, is that and this has a very strong domestic aspect as well, is that there's this burning hatred for the traditions and values of European Christians. And that's what we see, for example, with the starting with the anti-Confederate stuff here in the United States, but basically toward, I'll say it, white Christian English-speaking Americans as somehow this demon population that is the behind of everybody's ills. There's all this white supremacy out there lurking that's a danger to this country. Rebecca, who writes the Dissident Mama site, was talking about how interesting it is to look at the parallels between Dixiephobia and Russophobia in terms of depicting people as these retrograde, backward haters who are, of course, anything but. We know hatred is really all on the other side. So I think there is some nexus there.
Yeah, my wife is from South Africa, and we see a lot of the same thing going on there. I always tell people, if you want to know what the U.S. is going to look like in 10 years, just look at South Africa today. And you also saw it going on in it was Rhodesia. What is it? Zimbabwe now?
Rhodesia.
You saw the same thing, and so it really. I keep waiting. Well, let me go phrase this a little differently, because I want to touch on the rainbow fascism here towards the end before we finish and end it with that. They directly attack the culture. They attack the roots of the culture. They destroy like monuments and tear down the history, implementing a new kind of racial view of the history. That they do this in every. How are they going to accomplish that in Ukraine, in Russia? They're not going to use race. That's not going to be necessarily it. They have no other option but to use religion, right? So they enter in this new Ukrainian church, and then they claim that Russia is oppressing and repressing this church. That church becomes that race, the minority race of Eastern Europe, and they can pummel them with LGBTQ, whatever other acronyms they come up with.
That's a very, very good insight. I mean, I think in terms of the United States and Western Europe, it is largely demographic. You let a lot of foreigners in from the third world to simply change the people. I think it was Bertolt Brecht's expression is that the government has lost the confidence of the people, so they'll have to remove the people and elect a new people. And here in America, they're electing a new people. We see them storming across the border every day. And it's just the great replacement. Well, I'm sorry, that's a racist conspiracy theory, unless you're in favor of it, in which case it's really happening. So, but you're right. The attitude toward Russia is different. It's interesting that despite the horrendous death toll of communism, it was actually less destructive of national identities in the communist countries than what we're seeing in Western Europe and America today, because even though they killed lots and lots of people there, at least they did not import a lot of people who were not Russian or Polish or Hungarian or whatever. So those people still remained living in their own native countries when communism ended. We're not going to have the same luxury here at home. I mean, the idea is to simply create a kind of an anti-America, a non-America, all the people on the intersectionality spectrum that have some other identity than the historic American identity. And I think it's a very pernicious and very, I'm afraid to say, well thought out strategy that has a basis. One of the things I point out that I don't really get a whole lot of resonance with, even among people, I don't know what your ancestry is. I assume it's basically ethnic American. You're American. That's all you are. You're not Greek. You're not Russian. You might, maybe have, some German or something in there somewhere, Scots, Irish, whatever. You're just an American. You're the kind of people that founded this country, not me, not my bloodline. We came here later. At least Russians, as the core of the Russian state, know they're still Russians. Serbs still know they're Serbs. They're still Frenchmen and German and Spaniards who know they're those things. There are very few Americans who are aware of being ethnically American. If you ask a typical non-hyphenated American, who are you? Well, he'll say, well, my Constitution. Well, Constitution is not an ethnos. Oh, well, okay, I'm white. Well, white is not an ethnos either. I mean, a nation is a very complex thing. There are actually people called Americans who founded this country, who wrote our Constitution. They're why we have the institutions we have, and they don't even know they exist anymore, most of them. That's very worrisome to me.
Down where I live, where I'm from, it's not quite as bad as it is up in the north. So we have distinctive culture down here, especially in I'm from Louisiana originally. Like we have the Cajuns, right?
Yeah.
Creole kind of festivals and foods, and we very in touch with that part of who we are. Like if I'm gonna cook, it's gonna be a sauce piquant or a gumbo or something like that. I'm not messing around with anything else. That's just who I am. That's like what
is your name.
That's what I gravitate
Is your name Cajun?
To. No, it's not. Salmon's.
Is your name Cajun?
No. No. Salmon's is not a Cajun name. It's just the culture I grew up around. Yeah. It's just what I'm comfortable with.
Yeah.
It's what I know.
Yeah. And of course, that's part of the texture of every big country. We have these local regional cultures that add up to an American culture. But a part of America has simply lost that sense of identity.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of it is intentional. And I see that like that's really ultimately, yes, there's an economic struggle in Eastern Europe, and there's a struggle over resources and controlling resources. But ultimately, the way that the U.S. plans on getting those resources and controlling those resources is turning these nations into proxies by inserting degenerate culture and breaking down all moral barriers.
Yes, and at the same time, also breaking down the same culture, the same identity within our own country. I mean, I like to say that Americans have been sold on two great lies. One is that this is a civic state, not an ethnic state, and the other one is that this is a nation of immigrants. Neither one of those things is true. America was built by Americans. Our civic institutions reflect the identity of the people who established them, and America was certainly added to by people like me who came here as immigrants and Americanized. But what does Americanization mean? It means adopting the culture and the loyalties and the identity of the people who were here before us. Although obviously we changed some things, like in my case, Orthodoxy. But hey, y'all come in; it's fine.
Right. Well, it always struck me as odd that like I remember hearing around, and I was young when the Berlin Wall came down, when the Soviet Union collapsed. I was real young, but
Mhm.
you remember that everybody was making a big deal about the importation of Levi's, of blue jeans, into Eastern Europe. And it kind of
Yeah,
strikes me now that, oh, okay, I see what they were doing. If you get a
yeah,
culture that is proud of their heritage, that lives as a national identity, and is protective of their resources, of their culture, of their land, like
yeah, yeah.
Iran, for example. If you get that type of culture and you infiltrate that culture and you get them concerned about these materialistic, degenerate, immoral things, and you distract them away from what made them unique, then you can take control.
Mhm.
You can turn them into a
Yeah.
proxy and spread your hegemony. And it never made sense to me why blue jeans entering, the Soviet bloc was a big deal until I started thinking about culture in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why things like Hollywood movies are such a big export to the rest of the world. Okay, fine, there's a lot of action, and all that kind of stuff, and they have a certain attractiveness to them, but it also helps to, turn them into little clones of whatever the hell it is we're turning out to be these days in our own country. It's sad. It's really sad.
Well, do you want to just the last minute or so, do you want to speak on the like regaining, I think it was Sam Adams, I believe it was, that said, in order for a people to remain free, they had to remain virtuous. Do you want to touch on the demoralization of the United States and how to like regain that? Because what I'm seeing is coming from a libertarian kind of, I wasn't really a libertine, but I had a lot of friends that were libertine, kind of hedonist kind
Sure.
of mindset, or like live and let live, who cares, non-aggression principle, as long as you're not hurting anybody, do what you want. And they're witnessing and realizing that, okay, wait a second, I'm watching what's happening around me, and I can
Yeah.
no longer say that it's okay to continue to live that way. And they're turning to a more traditional, looking for a Christian answer to a lot of these problems.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh gosh, well, it's very simple. You see, in 2024, either Trump or DeSantis will be elected, and all will be right with the world again. Everything will be just fine. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Maybe that won't happen. Here's the thing. I'm trying to look at this in the big picture. You're maybe familiar with the Strauss-Howe notion that there's a cycle in American politics that goes back to before the Revolution, even back to the English Civil War. That every
Right.
80 to 90 years we go through a major upheaval, and we're in the middle of that upheaval actually right now. I think. Um, America, look, constitution republics don't last long, historically speaking, and democracies don't last long at all. John Adams said there never was a democracy that didn't commit suicide. Our founding fathers didn't want to create a democracy for a reason because they knew
Mhm.
their Aristotle. They know how that goes. So we
Right.
had a confederal republic for about 80 or 90 years until Abraham Lincoln destroyed it. Um, that wasn't going to end well anyway. You look at it. And then for about 100 years, we had a federal democracy. And then starting in the World War II period, we got what I like to think of as a demagogic, oligarchic state marching toward tyranny. And that's what we've got
Right.
now. And the idea we're going to vote our way out of this, I think, is simply not realistic. The only thing I can think of is two processes that are sort of going on at the same time. That there is a core of people that wants to live in a normal country. Maybe they're not all virtuous people, but at least they're normal people. They want to live in a normal world, a normal place they can raise their kids, have a productive life, go to a decent church. Obviously, I hope the Orthodox Church, but at least be normal, decent people. And then we have the crazy people who also live in the same country with us. They want to occupy and destroy us, and they maybe will do so if they ever get the means to do it. We can't occupy and destroy them. It's not part of our ethos.
Right.
I think, in my only opinion, looking at the long term, the only way that can work out is if there is some separation of this country where some decent, normal state can be formed in part of what used to be the United States. For that to happen, I think we have to admit to ourselves a number of things. The American Republic, as we knew it, is gone. It was gone a long time ago. We're just a corpse walking now. I remember somebody on Twitter said, America today is like a corpse being consumed by maggots. Liberals are rooting for the maggots. Conservatives are rooting for the corpse. And you got to admit, okay, it's over, been there, done that. But nations, people still survive. What path is there for us as Americans going forward if this whole thing comes crashing down? And maybe what's happening in Ukraine will become the catalyst for the collapse of this unholy neocon, neoliberal global empire. And if that happens, then I think the United States will go through something like what the Soviet Union went through in the 1990s. Maybe something good will come out of that. Some place, some part of this country where normal people can build a normal life and not be, trying to implant, rainbow fascism, Bolshevism, Gnosticism, whatever you want to call it, on our kids and on the world. But I don't know how that's going to. I think we have to go through a very difficult period of dislocation, if not complete collapse, and it's going to be very, very tough in the world and in our country for a while. But maybe something good can come from the ashes.
Yeah. I told a friend a while back, I did a podcast with a friend of mine, and I told her, I said, she goes, so how does this end up? Like, does this global agenda work? And I say, well, ultimately, no, it's not going to work. It's going to end up eating itself like the Ouroboros, just like the communists did, just like the Nazis did. I said, the only thing you have to worry about is how many people are going to get hurt in the process.
That's exactly right, and that's why some people think that, oh well, somehow we'll change course. These people cannot change course, just like the Soviet Union could not change course. Gorbachev wanted to try to change course, and all he did was end up destabilizing what was left of the system. Trump, in some ways, I think may have been something like Gorbachev. He exposed the flaws in the system, helped destabilize it, but he couldn't save it. And now we just got. What can you possibly say about Biden? I mean, it's just a joke.
Yeah. I think Trump slowed it down for a minute, just long enough for Biden to say, well, I can accelerate it a lot faster than you can slow it down.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it's just the rot is just becoming. I think it's terminal. That what is left of an American regime is such a big dumb dinosaur that simply cannot change course. It just does what it does until it reaches the final collapse. Especially since so many people in the system cannot afford to change anything because those McMansions in the DC suburbs, they don't pay for themselves. These people can only keep doing what they're doing while their paychecks are coming.
That's right. Well, Mr. Jatras, I could talk to you all day. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and I hope I can have you back on sometime.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You have anything
looking forward to being with you again.
You have anywhere that people can reach you, find anything you're writing or anything like that?
The only thing you can find is I'm reachable on Twitter, and that's my only social media. A lot of my writings are posted on uns.org. My old writings on Chronicles, you can find some of them on Chronicles magazine. Luckily, with a name like Jatras, I come up pretty easily on internet searches. On Strategic Culture Foundation, a lot of my writings are there, and actually I'm pulling them together into a book, which I'm tentatively thinking of titling "I Tried to Warn You."
Awesome. Didn't you do some work with the Mises Institute as well?
I've known some people there over the years. I don't have any direct connection to the Mises Institute. Maybe you're thinking about the Ron Paul Institute.
Maybe it was the Ron Paul Institute. Maybe
no, you're thinking of the Ron Paul Institute. Ron Paul Institute. Yeah, I gave a speech in 2020 called, 2021 called "It's Later Than You Think," taken from Father Seraphim Rose, and then I did an update last year called "It's Even Later Than You Thought." So it's a lot lot of what we talked about today. It was basically to some young people there. Unfortunately, after I spoke, they had to take away their belts and shoelaces and put them on suicide watch. So, uh,
Young kids nowadays.
kids
They don't
nowadays, yeah.
they don't make them like they used to, right? So
Well, I feel it's my job as a cranky old boomer to scare the out of young people.
all right, Mr. Jatras. I really do appreciate it.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Thank you, Tommy. Take care.
Yes, sir. You have a good rest of your day.